Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. So we have been through the best of horror that I read in 2020. We have been through the best of everything else that I read in 2020. And we have been through my most disappointing things that I read in 2020. So the next logical step is to talk about my overall stuff from 2020, and that is stats. So you stats nerds, this is for you. So for 2020, I did not really set out any intentional goals for myself, aside from the fact that I wanted to continue to read diversely and expand that more. And I'll get to where I talk about that a little bit later. But that was really the only goal that I set for myself. I didn't do any reading challenges. I didn't do anything like that because I know myself, and I know that generally when I set challenges like that for myself, then I tend to fail. Let's just go ahead and talk about statistics. So how do I track my reading? The giant spreadsheet that I use, which is where I get all of the graphs that you will see for this, is from Brock. His Twitter handle is Let's Read. I will link the 2021 version in the down bar below, as well as his Twitter page. It is a super, super useful spreadsheet that you can customize. In addition to the spreadsheet, obviously I also use Goodreads because I feel like most of the community uses it. And just here recently, I think it was at the start of the new year, actually, I did start using the story graph. All of that information will be linked down below if you want to be my friend on Goodreads. That is also in the drop-down menu below, or Dropbox, whatever the fuck it's called. So we're going to talk about actual statistics now. Let's get right into it. So the biggest goal that I set for myself was obviously my overall reading goal. So I set my goal at 85 and I blew past that. I ended up reading 133 books, which again, I just want to note that if you choose to not set a reading goal, then that is 100% great. If you read 100 books in a year, that's great. If you read 300 books in a year, that's great. If you read 2 books in a year, that's also great. So your worth, just as a general reminder, is not tied to how many books you read in a year. This is just how many I happen to read. So, like I said, I read 133 books, which was honestly a little bit surprising to me, especially since I was completely absent from the community for most of the year. However, that had a lot to do with just the general state of the world and the general state of my own mental health. So, that wasn't because I wasn't reading or consuming media or whatever the case may be. Just I couldn't put forth the mental effort to actually go through and film and edit and all of those things. It was all I could do to go to work and come home and take care of my house. So 133 books, I was pretty happy with that. 18 of those books were rereads, which is fine. I am 100% for rereading books. I know that I've talked about this before. I think that you can get different things out of different books at different points in your life. One of the other reasons that I also chose to reread a couple of different books was because I tend to, when I feel myself, and I learned this about myself in the last couple of years, if I feel like I'm about to start slumping super hard as far as, reading, I tend to reach for things that I've already read that I know that I loved, just because it keeps me engaged and it keeps me from just deciding that I hate everything that I read. So if we break that down into percentages and how many of those books were on my TBR from previous years, how many of them made their way onto my TBR for this year versus how many were rereads, 56% of what I read made its way onto my TBR from this year, this year being 2020, by the way. I was a little bit surprised whenever I read that number, but I also think that that's because I utilized my library a lot and I went into a really big true crime kick, which we'll talk about genres in a little bit, but I think that that's why that number was so high, because typically I do tend to read books that come from my own shelves, because I did not do a lot of buying this year, with the exception of some audiobooks, but I did not buy very many physical books at all. So that said, 40% came from previous years. So those are books that I already owned that I had been meaning to read for a while. And then 14% of what I read were rereads. So that comes out to 27,778 pages total, which doesn't sound like a lot. And like I said, that is because I listened to a lot of audiobooks this year, a lot. So that said, I listened to a lot of audiobooks and my total audiobook hours were 593 hours. However, I listen to audiobooks at 2 times speed. So that means that I only listen to 297 hours of audiobooks. However, that's 12 whole days. So I spent at least one full 24-hour period every single month listening to audiobooks, which I don't feel like that's a bad thing. It really allows me to multitask. I'm a huge fan of audiobooks, so but we won't get into that debate at the moment. So let's talk about like month breakdowns, right? So my best months of the year happen to be March, April, and May. All 3 of those months I read 16 books. I don't know how. My worst was November. I only read 4 books in November. That had a lot to do with anxiety. I got really caught up in the 24-hour bullshit news media cycle after the election, and I really allowed my anxiety to take over, in addition to it being a holiday season and I work in retail and blah, 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 all of those things. So it just wasn't a very good month for me as far as reading, but that's okay. The month that had the most pages was March, that had 4,891 pages, and the 2 months that had the least amount of pages were obviously November and then December as well. November only had 336 pages and December had 326. So the reason for that is I read significantly more books in December. However, that was part of my true crime binge that I was on at the time. And every single one of the true crime books that I read were actually audio. So there were a lot of audio hours that were logged that much, but not a lot of actual pages. So, and then while we're talking about pages, my longest book that I read this year was It, which is 1,090 pages. The edition that I read was, and then my shortest was I Am Not Your Final Girl, which is actually a poetry collection. It's 91 pages. It's a horror poetry collection, which I actually really did enjoy. It was my only poetry collection from the year. So then when we talk about formatting of the books that I read, 42% were physical and 58% were digital. Digital obviously being e-arcs, ebooks, audiobooks, and then physical being physical books. If you want to break that down further, 42% were physical, 40% was audio, and then 18% were ebooks. When we talk about publishing year, I don't read a ton of new releases from 2020. Most of my titles are backlist. However, 22% of what I read this year were from 2019 and 2020, which was a little bit surprising to me, honestly. And then obviously the rest of that was backlist. Now, how did I get the books that I read this year? 19% of what I read was purchased. Like I said, most of those were purchased via audio, whether it was from Libro FM or whether it was from Audible. 2% of what I read happened to be gifts from other people. 23% of what I read was from the library. 46% of what I read came from my own shelves. 8% came from Kindle Unlimited, and then 3% were ARCs that I received. So let's break down some genres. What did I read? And none of this is going to surprise you. Horror obviously being the biggest category with a whopping 42% of what I read for the year. Usually horror and mystery thrillers are fairly close together. However, horror beat everybody this time. Mystery and thrillers being the second most read genre, but only at 15% of what I read. Fantasy followed closely behind at 14%, which honestly surprised me a little bit. And then this was the most shocking thing of all, because I tend to not consume a whole lot of nonfiction, but nonfiction, true crime, was also 14% of what I read. Contemporary at 8%. I don't tend to consume a lot of contemporary, but the few that I did read this year were bangers. Science fiction at 5%. And literary fiction, historical fiction, and poetry each had 1%. So stayed pretty on brand last year as far as the genres that I read. So those were the genres. So how did it break down as far as like star ratings and things like that? So my average star rating for the year was 3.59, which again, like that's pretty standard for me. I tend to reach for things that I know I am going to enjoy. I know what I like, and I tend to avoid things that I am a little bit iffy about, just because whenever I hit slumps, my slumps tend to last a really long time, so I just tried to avoid that completely. So then whenever we break it down, 5 stars, I only gave 17 books this year 5 stars. And a lot of those were rereads. So it's like when you look at my favorite books of the year of last year, both in the horror and the everything else category, I didn't include any rereads because like what would be the point? They're books that you guys have seen me talk about before, so I'm not going to include those. Between 4.5 and 4 stars, I ended up giving 51 books or 4.5. 3 stars, 3 or 3.5. I gave 54 books. I gave 10 books 2 stars, and I only gave 1 book 1 star. So from there, let's talk about author gender breakdown. One of the things that I want to continue to do is to make sure that I am reading women and not just, dudes, especially just white dudes. However, this year, 57% of what I read were male authors, and then female was only 43%. So I didn't do as well as I wanted to in that, and I think that part of that is because of the true crime that I read. There are not a ton of women who write true crime. However, that is not an excuse, because if you want to read books by those people, they're there, you just have to seek them out. So I could have done a better job as far as that's concerned. So let's talk about diversity in fiction, and how I stacked up this year and compared to the previous years, and just how in general I did as far as that goes. I honestly was pretty on par with what I did last year. However, it is still not enough. It is nowhere near enough. Some of my absolute favorite books of the year were from authors of color, specifically Black women, actually. Roughly 69% of what I read could be considered not diverse. It wasn't written by a diverse author. It didn't have any kind of diverse main characters, and that's frankly embarrassing. So, I'm calling myself all the way out right now. Again, while it was roughly the same as last year, like the whole purpose was to be better than last year, and so I definitely failed as far as that goes. I will say that one of the successes that I did have is I did read at least twice the amount of Black authors this year, in 2020, than I did in 2019. And so I'll count that as a win, but again, we can be better. So that said, what am I actually going to do to change that? Number one, I read a lot of horror, and as many of you know, a lot of horror is white dudes. Lately, there has been a huge surge in women in horror, which is absolutely amazing. There is a blog that I follow, the Ladies of Horror Fiction. I'll link that in the description below. The women that run that are absolutely amazing, and I've discovered some really, really great women in horror in the last year. However, one of the things that I noticed this year is if you want specifically Black horror, you have to seek that shit out. And sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to find. There have been some lists that have been floating around, especially since the summer, that I have slowly been pulling titles from. And I will also link that information down below for those of you horror readers that also want to read more Black horror, because you should. I also have a specific shelf on my Goodreads that is specifically for Black horror, so you can check that out if we're friends on Goodreads. And then I also do have a challenge that I am going to be doing this year. I asked a group of friends to recommend me books that they loved that come from Black authors, some sort of diverse author, not just that has a token diverse character or whatever. And I had a lot of really great recommendations from that. So those are my stats for the year. And one of the reasons that I really enjoy doing videos like this and using these types of tools is it really makes me more self-aware of the things that I am reading and what I am consuming. And, to me, one of the most valuable things is reading things that are outside of your own viewpoint or outside of your own comfort zone, because, the world is not just your own personal view. And there are so many different parts of that. And so the word of the year for me this year and beginning last year too has been intentional. The word intentional. And what I mean by that, and this isn't just in reading, but just more in my own life as well. One of the things that I have struggled with my entire life, it feels like, is just generalized anxiety and imposter syndrome and things of that nature. And boy, let me tell you, it is fun. I have in the past not done a very good job dealing with those things. And one of the things that I really sought out to do in the last year, and especially here recently, is just, again, being more self-aware and being more intentional with my thoughts and my actions, and, really thinking about the things that I am doing, really thinking about, who I am and what I stand for, and make sure that I'm living those things every single day. Which sounds weird since I'm, a 30-year-old woman, that I'm figuring out who I am, but I don't think that that's a process that ever really stops. So a couple of the different things that I've been doing to be more intentional, in addition to like really evaluating the things that I'm reading, not just this is what I want to read, but I started reading tarot and like astrology, which is something that I've never in my life been into. I am really thinking about like meditation, really going in on like self-care, because I'm able to do those things right now, and really just trying to make sure that I'm the best version of myself so that I can move on to the next phase of my life. So I don't really know where that came from, but I think that to bring it back home, just being intentional. So not only am I being intentional with the things in my life, but I'm also being intentional with the things that I am reading, and just, like making sure that looking outside of my own experience and making sure that I am consuming stories that can broaden your worldviews. I think that that's something that's so incredibly important. The media that you consume should look like the world around you, and the world around you is not just a bunch of straight white people. So, you need to make sure that what you read reflects that. So that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys so very much for watching. If this is your first time here, hi, hello, and welcome. If you like what you see and you want to see more, you can click thumbs up. You can click subscribe if you haven't already. You can also check out the down bar below, where you can find all of my social media links, as well as a variety of different ways that you can support me. But that is it for this time. Thank you guys so much for watching, as always, and I will see you all next time. Bye.